Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good afternoon, and welcome to WCAT Radio and this edition of Inter Vitam at Mortem, Between Life and Death, interviews and discussion with the Catholic Bioethicist. I am your host, Dr. Mary Anne Urlakis. I am a classically trained and degreed bioethicist, and today I have with me a distinguished guest, a renowned scholar, Dr. Al Kertz, and he's going to talk about his travels in China, and in particular, issues regarding religious persecution. Before we begin, let's start with a prayer, as we always do. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Dear God, our heavenly Creator, you are the author of life and of truth, the reality that you will each and every human person into being, created from the moment of conception, bearing the dignity and imprint of your own image and likeness within the very essence of our being, is a mystery beyond human understanding. Please help us to have a greater appreciation of the gift of being created in your image and likeness. Help us to reverence that reality in our brothers and sisters, especially in the tiniest and most vulnerable among them. Help us to defend the sanctity of every human life from conception to natural death. We ask this through the intercession of Our Lady, the ever pure and all immaculate, Blessed Virgin Mary, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, again, thank you for tuning into this episode of WCAT Radio's Inter Vitam at Mortem, Between Life and Death, discussion and interviews with Catholic Bioethicist. Today, once again, I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Al Kertz. Dr. Kertz has joined us before in episode 27. Dr. Kertz spoke with us regarding the relationship between faith and science, between reason and faith. Dr. Kertz is the principal at Ann Hill, LLC. He's an expert in the nutrition, feeding, and management of dairy cattle. Dr. Kertz earned his doctorate from Cornell University in animal nutrition. Dr. Kertz's expertise has led him to numerous positions of leadership with the American Dairy Association, way too many awards and distinctions to mention here. And his career includes highly sought-after consultation work, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. And that leads us to the subject of China. Dr. Kertz has traveled to China, I believe 26, 27 times. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Kertz. Thank you so much for coming and interviewing with me today on this program.
Well, thank you for another opportunity, Mary Anne. I probably should give a little other background as to why I was doing this and how this came about. I grew up on a small dairy farm in Missouri, about an hour south of St. Louis, and very faith-filled parents. So I have been fortunate in a sense, inheriting that. And I went to the University of Missouri and got an undergraduate master's degree in the area of dairy science and nutrition, kind of reflecting my background and interest in dairy cattle, having grown up on a dairy farm. And then I had a couple years in the Army, 1 year in the Boston area in NADIC Research and Development Labs, and then another year in Thailand managing food supply during the Vietnam War. Then I did my PhD at Cornell, and I came back to St. Louis, not by design, just the way it worked out with Ralston Purina Company, and I was in their research and development area, and then did field-related work and had a consultant program and worked for the international company for a couple years until we were bought out by another company and wiped out. And so in 2001, I started doing consulting work. And that was also a period that, with that kind of a change, it caused me to reflect more spiritually. So it was kind of an epiphany, which was very good. And the reason I got involved in China was because about 20 years ago, a vice premier made a very public pledge that he wanted every school-age child to have a glass of milk a day. Wow. Now, even with a one-child policy, that's a lot of milk. And historically, if you look at the Asian countries, they're primarily their diet is primarily based, animal part, on poultry and pigs. And dairy is not so much a part of that, or beef cattle. And part of that's because of the climate and the land and that sort of thing.
Not a lot of grazing room.
No, that's right, and a lot of people. And cows don't like hot, humid weather. They don't do so well. And so a lot of the Asian countries have that, like, say, certainly Vietnam and Thailand and a lot of China and the Philippines. And so there isn't that much. But this created a kind of a sea change and a rapid growth curve where they really had no background or experience in dairy farms, and so that's all been a learning process. So I got involved in December 2007 with an invitation to come to Beijing and to give a series of presentations to graduate students at this research institute and at a company that was in the milk processing business. And so that's how I got started, and then that led to working with other companies and organizations since 2007. And that's why I say I think it's 26 times I've been to China during that era, once before that in Hong Kong in 2002 and neighboring Shenzhen. And I tell people, if there's any doubt how many times I've been there, the government there would know for sure because they track you every step of the way.
I would bet.
So that's kind of the background of it. And I'm looking at some notes. Yeah, most of the people in China, if you look at the geography of China, it's somewhat shaped like the U.S., but of course it's larger. But most of the people live in the approximate eastern third of China. And so the western third is higher elevation, more remote. And most of the dairy cows are in the northeastern part of China because that gets colder, certainly in the winter, and it does get hot and muggy in Beijing, for instance, in the summer. And it's because the weather patterns change. In the summer, the weather comes off the ocean, and that's where Beijing gets hot, humid weather during the summertime, whereas in the wintertime, the weather comes down from the north, Siberia and Mongolia, and so they also have very cold winters. But cows...
There's some extremes there.
Yes, very
extremes
very much
in weather. So that's another
right.
issue with cows and livestock is that you're talking about some serious extremes in weather. It's not temperate.
Yes, and the reason it's more of a problem for cattle than, say, pigs or chicken is cows have a major rumen fermentation, a very large stomach that they ferment feedstuffs, and that's why they can use forage and grass and silage and all that. And that is like an internal furnace because when you have fermentation, it produces heat. And that's why I think this is true. Nobody's said it's not yet. If you look at large animals in the wild that don't hibernate, virtually all of them are ruminants. Because in the wintertime, the rumen fermentation helps them stay warm. But in the summertime, it's the opposite. It makes them miserable. And so when the temperature, the external temperature, gets hot and humid, what they do to adjust to that is eat less. Well, when you eat less, you grow less or you produce less milk. So that's why they don't do well in the summertime. And in fact, we have cooling systems using fan and soakers for hot, humid climates in order to accommodate them. So, and that's why most of the cows are in the northeastern part of China, and that's where I spent most of my time. There are 22 provinces. I've been in 15, and the main ones I haven't been on are large ones in the western part of China.
And I've read that you've been in, 3 or 4 municipalities and have used 14 of their airports. So you have traveled extensively throughout China.
Yes, and I would think I would be going on the average about twice a year, and typically about 2 weeks at a time, because it's a long trip, and I try to maximize the time I spend there working with different groups, and also spent some time in Taiwan. I was in China in August for 2 weeks, and 5 days of that I spent in Taiwan. And I might as well bring it in right up front. Taiwan is very different than China. They have the common Chinese heritage and culture and even religious background, but it's been 70 years since the separation of Taiwan from mainland China. And the first thing I noticed, the most different thing I noticed the first time I went to Taiwan, was children and families. Because they still have multiple children. Yes. And I've gotten to know one fellow in particular that I work with, his company, and he has another company. He does some work in China. And we both agreed that was the biggest difference between the two countries, notwithstanding, the democracy in Taiwan versus the communist regime in mainland China. But when I said, what do you think is second, he very quickly said, compassion. The Taiwanese are compassionate people. The Chinese were, yes, and Chinese were typically compassionate, but with 70 years of communism, that has really destroyed the fabric of the family and their culture. And so they don't have that. They are really adverse to helping out people because they're concerned they may get accused of, if helping somebody, of causing the harm to that person they're trying to help. It's kind of this every person for themselves mentality. And that was really illustrated to me one time by our youngest daughter, who spent 20 months in China in 2009 and 2010. And I've learned a lot from her experiences. She went into a language immersion course and then worked for 1 year for an NGO in China, in Beijing. And so she could speak the language, at least rudimentarily. And one morning she was walking from the apartment she was staying in to the office where she worked. And at intersections, you can often find all kinds of vehicles besides cars. There'll be bicycles, there'll be motorbikes, and sometimes smaller trucks and that sort of thing. So one morning she's walking to her office. A car comes through this intersection and clips an old man on a bicycle and knocks him down. Well, Mary stopped, and no one else did. It's just not what they do. And she went over and helped the man up and checked to see if he was okay. And to this day I'm thinking, what did that man think was going on? Here's this young American woman speaking Mandarin Chinese, helping him up. What's going on?
I had a concussion.
Yeah. Well, then when Mary got to work, she happened to bring up this topic, and they all said, and mostly Chinese in the office, all said, well, we would never do that. And so Mary took the opportunity to talk about the Good Samaritan, that we're, as Christians, as Catholics, we're called to help people. And that's why she did that.
How did that
One of
go
those
over
teachable moments. Yeah.
How did that go over with that teachable moment?
Well, it was very different. It's not something they do. It's not part of their culture. And that's what this fellow in Taiwan was pointing out. They don't have the compassion. On the other hand, they're still very hospitable people. When you come, they want to be sure that you are well taken care of. They want to show you their culture, their sites. There's a history of that, and they're proud of that. So I've been to the Great Wall in sections probably 3 or 4 times, as close as one's near Beijing, and the other sites, the Summer Palace in the winter and the summer, in Beijing and various other sites, and because they're very hospitable people, and maybe in spite of their their communist heritage over the last 70 years.
So there's that cultural hospitality, but because of you have a bunch of, as a one-child policy, people have grown up as only children.
Yes, and that started in 1979. So you've had 40 years of that, 2 generations. And I've gotten to know a number of the graduate students and work with them at this one research institute and some other places too. And so I've seen them, finish and their degrees and then go into jobs and positions and sometimes see them later. And, it occurred to me that they're that second generation. So they not only are a single child, they have no cousins, no aunts or uncles, 2 parents, and 4 grandparents. So it's an upside-down triangle, and it's going to have huge impact, not that it really hasn't, but beyond that, because it's been going on for 2 generations. And one analysis I read in a book called Empty Planet that gets into demographics around the world indicates that they will peak at about 1.4 billion people in China. And then by the end of this century, just doing the arithmetic, they will have half that population. They've reached the point of no return because of the 2 generations of one child. And as a result of that, now you have the parents and the grandparents, when a family would often be 2 or 3 generations, and before the one-child policy, the average number of children per family was 6. So the families took care of themselves, and 2 or 3 generations would live together. And then, in addition to that, when a man and a woman were married, the woman goes with her husband's family. And that's why there has been such a, not necessarily, not a need, but such a strong interest in having boys versus girls, is because the parents know that once their daughter marries, she leaves their family and goes with her husband's family. And
no
when you only have,
in theory.
yeah, well, just the way it is, I don't know the exact origin of that in their culture. But then the
she's
oldest,
no longer considered a help to that family. She is her ability to help them, to be hands-on, to help them. She is now, her duty lies with her husband's family, no longer with her family.
And then the oldest son is responsible for his parents' health and his parents' livelihood. So if a family only has a daughter and she leaves, who takes care of the parents when they retire?
Sure.
So that's why it's created this real disruption in the fabric of their culture. And again, you don't see that in Taiwan. So what the government's doing now, they have to take responsibility. And so they're building these huge apartment cities near major cities. And, there's so many cities in China that have over 1 million population that I don't even know about. And so they're building these huge apartments. And one time I did a rough estimate to try to figure out how many people are living in this one apartment complex. And they're very tall, of course. And I figured roughly 30,000. And, in fact, the government has a program now to relocate people from the rural areas to the major areas, urban areas, and they expect to have 80% of their population in major urban areas within the next, 10 years or something like that. And they sort of have to do that because the young people in the rural areas, when China's economy grew so fast and they went into all kinds of factories and so on, the young people left the rural areas to go work in the factories. And most of the factories are in the southern part of China, down towards Shanghai and Shenzhen, which is the major city across the border from Hong Kong. And when they left and they got married and they had their one child, often what they would end up doing is their parents would take care of this child in the village. And they'd come back and forth and visit them. Well, that's created another issue. There was an article in Science Journal about a professor from Stanford University has studied the development of these children cared for by their grandparents in the rural villages and areas. And what they found, not surprisingly, is they don't develop psychologically and socially and as well as those in the urban areas. So it's creating those disadvantaged situation for those children cared for by the grandparents, because in a lot of cases the grandparents have limited education in the rural areas, and the young people, once they left to go to the factories and they leave their one child with their grandparents, that's one of the consequences. There are other consequences.
One would think it would also create a clash of values, too. If the grandparents are raising the children in the rural areas, they're raising with more traditional values.
Absolutely.
Than what the kids would be seeing their counterparts in the city. And from what you're saying here, we have a one-child population that has developed a subculture. Interesting for social experiments, because you have Taiwan there that is a perfect control. You have the same people, the same history in a sense up to 40 years ago, and now you have an experiment. I hate to use that word, but in essence, a social experiment. And what we have are folks who don't have compassion, who are disconnected. I would imagine the loneliness is great. And
it would have to be. And
isolated,
related to what you just talked about.
Huge,
Yeah, what you just talked about, there's an Australian university that did a study, and I read a brief synopsis of it in Science, to try to determine what's the consequences of having one child in not only development and socialization, but the kind of adults they become. And their biggest problem was they really had no control population within China. If you go to Taiwan, you have the physical and all the other differences and 70 years and so on. So you don't have a true control. You can make the comparison that you did, but you don't have a true control. So they had to structure various tests that they could try to pull this out of these young people as to how were they developed being the only child. And one of the things they found was that they were risk aversive because they don't have the socializations of having siblings and learning to negotiate and, deal with all the intricacies that children learn within a family. So they didn't have that. And because they're a single child, and if you're the parents and you want the best for that child, there's a high degree of pampering and all kinds of benefits. Education is very high on the schedule for the parents, and so they will often hire tutors to make sure their single child is well schooled. And when they get into high school level, that can determine the high schools they go to. And when they get to college, it does definitely determine. They take these national exams, and that determines what colleges or universities they can attend.
Wow, it is a fascinating, although terrifying, social picture that you're painting here. How does religion enter the scene?
Well, before I get to that point, I want to mention one other thing. The government has been slow to change their one-child policy. Now, there were exceptions allowed, but you had to apply to have a child, and you had to apply for exceptions. For instance, the rural areas were allowed to have more children, but most of the population lives in the urban areas, okay? The other thing was they have about 50 different ethnic groups in China. They're allowed to have more than one child, but they probably account for 5% or less of the population, so that doesn't have a big impact. So about 5 years ago, I think the government finally realized that, well, maybe they better do something about it. So then they said, well, okay, if one or both of the parents are from one-child families, they can then apply to have 2 children. And then they've even further opened those restrictions. But here's what's happened. Their culture has totally changed. So I know a lot of the young people that got married and so on, and I ask them, and they're very open on various things, and I asked them, I said, will you have 2 children? And they've all said no, because it's so expensive. We want to give the best to this one child, including education, and we can't afford it, and so we're only going to have one child. So that's the problem, is that policy is going to continue to live because it's become part of their culture.
It's been indoctrinated, sure.
Yes. Okay, so now you ask about religion. Well, I didn't realize this at first till our daughter was there. So I started going in 2007, and she was there in 2009 and 10. Although I did have an inkling of it because there was a fellow I knew from Korea, from the company I'd worked with before, and he was Catholic, and he had a PhD, but he got into the management side. And in December 2007, I was able to meet with him in Beijing, even though he didn't live there at the time, but he was there for business. And he told me there were like 4 Catholic churches in Beijing, and Chengdu, where he was, also had about a handful of them. But the government, being communist, historically communists are atheists, and they suppress, as we've seen in Russia and Eastern Europe, religion. Because in their mind, you can't be loyal to them, the government, and also be loyal in a sense to God or your religion. So they typically suppress that and prosecute or persecute, that. And what I found out from my daughter is that the government has control over what the public knows as the Catholic Church, and they call it the Patriotic Catholic Church. So in other words, they're allegiant to China as a government. There is the true Catholic Church, but it's underground. And our daughter found out that there was one of those in the Beijing area near the airport, but if she went there to Mass, like on Sunday, she had to bring her passport and could only be admitted if she had her passport. Now, there are...
Still being tracked.
Yes. But there is the underground church, but, having been 70 years under communism, it's dying out because of the people getting older and dying, and the bishops the same way. So what has unfortunately happened is the government has wanted to control the appointment of bishops. Well, under Pope John Paul II, they reached some, I don't know if you'd call it an agreement or an understanding, but, the government was becoming a little bit more open during that time and becoming more capitalistic and so on. And as a result, there was some agreement reached where there would be a group of bishop candidates offered, and the Vatican would say to the government, we would want to appoint somebody from this group. Are you okay with the group? And so the government would have some leeway there and say, well, no, we don't like this one or that one, whatever it was. But the Vatican would appoint the bishops. And that kept the one true Holy Catholic Apostolic faith progression. But my understanding from a bishop here in St. Louis at the time was their sacraments, even if the bishops aren't appointed by the Vatican, the sacraments are still listed. So the ordination of the priests were. So now more recently that has changed because under Xi Jinping, who became the president in 2012, at that time a president could serve 2 5-year terms. But entering into his second term, he then made himself president for life.
Oh, wow.
So he has amassed more power in all kinds of ways than anyone in China since Mao. And that gives him the ability to do a lot of controlling. Traditionally, and I think officially, the government recognizes 5 religions: Protestantism, Catholic, Buddhism, Islam or Muslim, and Taoism. But he has been exerting more and more control over those. I've read a book published in 2017 about the souls of China, and the author obviously had been there many times, and he gives a lot of examples of what has happened. Like in one province alone, there were 1,500 Christian churches that had to remove their crosses on their steeples. So they don't want them known. And the government is increasingly surveilling all these individual churches. Bibles are not legally allowed in China. And I know that was an issue even when they had the Olympics in Beijing in 2008, whether the athletes could bring in their Bibles. And there are Bibles there. They're just, it's just all undercover.
I've seen pictures this week even of churches being destroyed, steeples being destroyed, churches being destroyed.
Well, even yesterday in our Archdiocese newspaper, there's an article from the Catholic News Service about many think Chinese regulations are meant to stymie worship and growth. And again, it's a new government edicts. The Pope Francis entered into some agreement with the government in 2018, but it's still secret what it is. But it has to do with this issue of the appointment of bishops. And I know that the retired Cardinal of Hong Kong was very opposed to this because he said it's going to put the true Catholic underground church in China at risk. They're going to be more and more persecuted.
What's happened.
Yes, that's what would happen. And so
We're
what
seeing
this
the fruit of that today.
Yeah, and what the article says is that the government now is introducing new regulations where they have to provide all this and this kind of information and follow up and so on. And since many of the remaining true Catholic churches are in the rural areas, the rural people are saying, well, we can't do that. We can't keep up with that. We can't do those kinds of reports and follow those kinds of regulations. But it's all kind of tightening the noose on the church there.
On the true church.
Yes, on the true church. But even I think the other religions are facing restrictions, as was pointed out in his book. Like, for instance, Beijing is sort of in the northeastern section of the country, and right north of it, those provinces, including Inner Mongolia, which is right below the country of Mongolia, they are traditionally Muslim. And I've been in that area quite a bit because there's a lot of dairy farms there. And I've even seen relatively new mosques. But, they could be 10 years old and they look new to me. And in much of that area, they don't eat pork. They don't have pigs. They have a lot of sheep. And Inner Mongolia has the grass terrain, and so a lot of sheep are grazed there. And so the meat of choice there is lamb or mutton. And what the government has tried to do is kind of soft sell this sort of like they've been doing to Hong Kong, tightening the noose. And so they said, well, local religions are okay because they're cultural. But then they don't like the Christian religions, and especially the Catholic religion, which is hierarchical.
Sure.
So that's why they're putting the pressure on those religions, and even the Muslims. And you must know about the the former Tibet area and Xinjiang province, where the Uighurs, the Uighurs, that's a large cultural population which is Muslim. And the government has been really restricting them. And part of it is because there have been a couple terrorist attacks in other parts of China from some members of that province. Well, then that creates the excuse for the government to re-educate them and to help them out and all this and that. And so just this year, through satellite photos and other ways, they were able to determine that there's an estimated 1.5 million Uyghurs in re-education centers, concentration camps. So they have to learn Chinese, they have to learn Chinese history, they have to abandon their language and their culture, and that's what their re-education is all about. Now, when I go to China...
The BBC did a good article on this, 2019, I believe, and
yes.
Documented some of the issues in these re-education camps, being forced to sing communist songs, children being separated from parents, truly human rights violations, notwithstanding the human rights violation of being deprived of your liberty to live where you wish and your association with your family. There are also the questions of forced organ removal, organ harvesting, and trafficking. And we can get into that later. I want you to keep going on, but we'll come back to that at the end because that's a huge issue.
Yes. So back to Catholicism, what I found out from my daughter was there's a rather prominent Catholic church, St. Joseph, and even has a single website. I don't know if you can still find it, but it's Patriotic Church, and it's down near the Forbidden City, which is in Tiananmen Square and the surrounding buildings, and it's only a couple blocks from Wang Fuying, which is the high-end shopping street in Beijing. And so from her, I found out about this church, and since it's not too difficult to get there, and the Mass is licit, and the priest is, and so on, so I go there whenever I can on Sunday mornings, go to Mass. And I've been doing that off and on, and, I work with some of the Chinese and the institutes and companies, and I don't hide it, I don't make it prominent, but I can say matter-of-factly, they might say, well, what did you do this morning on Sunday? I said, well, I went to church. Well, where's that? There's this church down here. And what I found out is they sort of expect that's what I do whenever I can, which is sort of like being a witness in a way because they have no concept of this in their culture over the last 70 years.
So you are evangelizing in that sense, too. They respect you, clearly. They respect you. You're invited there so often. Your expertise is sought after. And when they ask you what you did on Sunday, and you tell them, this is a priority for me. And as you mentioned in some of the written notes that you had sent me, it's not necessarily easy to get there. You ask cab drivers how to get there, and they're not anxious to take you.
Well, what I found out I had to do, Mary Anne, was I made a copy of that website, and then I had one of my Chinese friends write in their Chinese characters the address. And so what I would do, staying in a hotel, I would go to the 8 o'clock Mass on Sunday morning, and so about 7:30 I'd go down, and there'd usually be a queue of taxis, and either engage the concierge or go out there and show them this and indicate that's where I want to go. And, they might say no or, just kind of wave off because maybe they don't know where that really is, or else for whatever reason they didn't want to take me. And I understood that. But eventually I'd find somebody who would take me. But sometimes these things get a little bit interesting because one time I was staying at his hotel and I went to the concierge and I showed him this. And, he spoke some English because it was an international hotel. And so he takes it on himself. He takes that and go out to the street where the queue of the taxi cabs are, and the first guy pulls up, and the concierge is talking to him, and he gets out. The taxi driver gets out, and he's got his cell phone, and they're talking back and forth, and I'm trying to help him out because I figured the taxi driver doesn't know maybe where it is, but I don't speak Mandarin, so I wasn't privy to what they were saying. But it was like they both wanted to make this work. The taxi driver was really engaged, and the concierge was engaged, and they're trying to figure it out. And
this is an act of hospitality. This is an act of pride and hospitality.
Yes. And then all of a sudden, the concierge, who was a tall young man, straightens up, pulls his hands together in front of his face, and bows. And I said, yes! Because that was his way of telling the taxi driver, that's a place you go to pray. And then the taxi driver took me.
Amazing. And you witnessed to both of them as well.
Yes, and then another funny thing that happened one time, because I sort of know the way, and these taxi drivers aren't using GPS. They know all the streets and everything, but I sort of know the way because, sometimes the taxi driver might take it a long way or whatever.
Right.
So one time I wasn't quite sure. I thought we were getting close, but I wasn't recognizing something. And I was about ready to say something. And this taxi driver pulls into a parking garage next to a hotel. And I'm getting ready to say, no. And he pulls through it, pops out the other side, and we're 2 blocks from the church. So he had his own shortcut. Yes.
That's great. That is great.
Another time, I was at a different hotel, an international hotel, and I was trying to get a taxi driver, and I talked to the concierge, and he said the taxi driver says from where we were, it was a long way around to get to this church. So I gathered what there was a street that he couldn't go through, and that could well have been this shopping street because it's a passenger only or a pedestrian only street. So I thought, well, okay, take me to that point, and I'll get out and walk up the street. And I thought it was the right street, but I had this, this copy, this page, and one time I stopped and asked a couple women, and they just waved me off like, I don't know, or what. And I get a little further up, and here's 2 men, and, I show them this, and they're nodding their heads, like, yeah, that's right. And then I motion, like, right, left, straight ahead, and they motioned straight ahead, and that's what it was. I was just a few blocks away. So that's the hospitality again, where they want to help you out, even if they don't understand why you're doing what you're doing.
Wow. When you were there for Mass, for Sunday Mass, how full was the church?
Full. It was the most encouraging thing I've seen in China. The people all participate. They sing. They're just enthusiastic. One time I didn't quite understand what was going on. They had some young children. Well, usually the children bring up the gifts at the offertory. But it was a Father's Day program. And they had a bunch of children involved and so on. And as far as I knew, they had, every hour, because when I'd come early for the 8 o'clock Mass, I'd come in the back of the Mass, and 7 o'clock Mass would be just finishing up. And then people would fill in. And so that led to another interesting experience I had one time. When I go there and I work with this institute, their graduate students, one of them is usually assigned to be with me, and they do that from a hospitality standpoint. They also want the graduate student to have the experience of speaking English and so on. And so I get to know the graduate students too, so it's a plus. So I got to know one of them on this one trip, and she was assigned to me. And the hotel where I was staying, there was a program, a dinner at another hotel a little distance away, but within Beijing. And I said, well, why don't I stay down that other hotel? Well, it turns out that the hotel and the university belong to the Air Force, and they don't allow foreigners to stay. That's just a policy. So I get there for the dinner, and I was a little early, and this young woman who I knew because she'd been signing me before comes up and we start visiting. And then I noticed she has this little cross on a chain around her neck. And I was really curious because I've never seen that in China. So I said, are you a Christian? And she said, no, my mother is. And so I thought, that's interesting. That she'd say she's not a Christian and she's wearing this and her mother is. And so later that evening, she was going to take me back through a taxi to my other hotel. So I had a chance to visit with her more in detail. And I said, where's your mother? Well, my mother lives in this city, which I knew is some distance away. And this graduate student was finishing her PhD. She was married. Her husband was veterinarian. And they had a 5-year-old daughter. And so she was finishing her graduate work separated from her family. And that's not unusual in China. They have to do things separate. I've even seen it where the young husband worked at the airport. He was an engineer at the airport in Beijing, and his wife was in this research institute in graduate school. And they got together on weekends. It was too difficult to go back and forth and too expensive. So they make a lot of sacrifices. So I said, well, what does your mother do? And she says, well, my mother takes my daughter with me to church all the time. And I said something innocently like, well, I go to church in Beijing, like I'll go tomorrow morning. And I was shocked because this graduate student said, well, I want to go with you. And then I lost for a little bit. I thought, well, what do I do now? And I thought, well, I shouldn't say no. And so I said, okay. I said, now I usually go to the 8 o'clock Mass, so that would mean leaving the hotel at 7:30. And I said, but I knew where she had to come from to get to my hotel. I said, why don't we go to 9 o'clock? Because that gives you more time to get to where I am, and then we'll leave at 8:30. And so she was there at 8:30, and we got a taxi, went down there, and I stood in the back of the church while the 8 o'clock Mass was finishing up. And when it was finishing up, we're standing by the door in the back, and there's a holy water fountain there. And so when it was cleared out enough, I said, well, okay, let's go down towards the front of the church. And so as we turned around, the holy water fountain was right there. She dipped her finger in it and made the sign of the cross just like it was normal for her. We went on down, and then I realized her mother must be Catholic.
Yeah.
Because Christians don't do that process.
And her daughter as well, then.
Yes, and so when we got down below, then as the crowd was clearing out, there were still people there praying, and I said, it doesn't look like they're getting ready for another Mass. And so there were two women sitting in front of me, and one obviously understood English, and she turned around and she said, that's right, the Masses are 6, 7, and 8, and then there's one in the afternoon or something like that. And I said, oh, I didn't even realize that. I assumed they were like 9 o'clock or so on. And so I said, well, to this young woman, I said, if you don't mind, I'd like to stay a few more minutes and then say some prayers, and then we'll go back. So we did. And then I was talking to her further, and I said, about her mother, and she said, well, my mother takes our daughter with her all the time to church. She sings in a choir and so on and so forth. So she said, my daughter will probably be a Christian too.
Wow.
Well, then here's the other part that's interesting.
You.
I was asking this young woman more about her arrangement as a graduate student, and she received like 1,400 RMB a month. The Institute provides her with a place to live, and but then she has to provide her own food and any other cost. And so then 1,400 RMB is about $200 a month with the current exchange rate. And so I did a little quick calculation in my mind. She took a taxi from where she lived to my hotel, and then she'd have to take one back. I paid for the round trip. So I said to her, well, that must have cost you about 150 RMB or something like that. And she said yes. And I said, okay, here is your money. I appreciate what you've done, but I don't want you to penalize yourself so much. You basically were spending 10% of your monthly allotment to come meet me to go to church. But she did.
And she was willing to do it.
Yes. And she did take
really
that,
beautiful.
Which I was glad she did. But you just don't know what's going on under the surface.
Right.
Because you don't see these things. You don't have the engagement. And the other thing I find out is after 70 years of communism, they, especially the younger ones, are more open, as I said. But the other ones, they don't tell you what they're thinking because they could get in trouble.
Right.
If you tell people what you think. So I sometimes
and there's a lot riding on that now. I've read the articles about the facial recognition software and the social scoring, not able to leave the country, not able to travel freely within the country, depending upon your social score.
It's more and more control, and they have massive.
Controlled.
Yeah, they have massive networks. You have to assume that when you're there, you, of course, know you can't access Google, Facebook, Time Magazine, even some newspapers. It just doesn't work because when the Arab Spring hit, they were so concerned with what happened there that they banned all these social medias. They have their own, but they banned all these others. They tightened up all sorts of security things, and if anything, they doubled down on controlling people and knowing where they're going.
What began with the Arab Spring, the messages were passed on a dating site that completely flew below the radar of all of the screening. So here was wow.
And you can't even walk. You can't even walk across Tiananmen Square to the Forbidden City now. It's a big gathering place, and, of course, that's where the massacre was in 1989, 30 years ago. And so what they've done after Arab Spring, they put up these wrought iron fences on the edge of the sidewalk and the street. So I was there one time, and somebody else wanted to take me to the Forbidden City. I've been there a couple of times. I said, sure, let's go. And when we came out, we had to go 3 blocks before we could get to a point where we could get a taxi. But you might not think anything of it if you didn't know that it changed after the Arab Spring.
Right. And it has become, it is really illustrative to see just how tight the securities and what the technology is. Not only face recognition, but iris recognition from a distance. You had mentioned in some of the notes that you had sent me, some of the photographs, how it is cultural that at every one of these events there are group photos taken. and it is part of the culture, but I'm sure that those photos have also been used, cataloged. Everyone knows where you've been and who else has been with you. So for everyone at St. Joseph's Church who were there for Mass on each of those Sundays, there are truly Chinese officials who are incognito who are also present during those liturgies, cataloging who is in that church at the time.
You would have to assume that. Yeah, that's the way it is. Yes. But, of course, as long as the Patriotic Church, Catholic Church, is in favor, maybe they're okay, but they could still be gathering all that information. So if they decided to tighten down in the future, then they'd have all that information.
Sure. Allow the freedom right now so that they can flesh out just who is going there before they truly restrict it. Mm-hmm. That is really an interesting scenario, and one that really demands our prayer and we really owe it to our brothers and sisters in Christ to know what is going on in their country, to pray for them,
yes.
And to learn as much about this as we can.
And I've read that their estimates, there are as many as 100 million Christians in China, but there's really no way to know. And I'm convinced from what I've seen that, if religion was legal, I think that country would just open up to Christianity. I think so. Just amazing.
When my husband and I were graduate students years ago, I was working in the laboratory that he was doing his PhD in. We had befriended some Chinese graduate students who were visiting, and they both ended up converting to Catholicism while they were here. And I remember Su Yan coming and asking lots of questions day after day, first very skeptical, but over time asking questions. And it was the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty, that brought her into the faith. Ken would show her under the microscope the same things that they were looking at and show her the symmetry right down to the tiniest degree and say, this could not have happened accidentally. Look at this beauty. And slowly she was drawn into the faith, and both she and her husband converted. I also sadly remember watching the two of them sitting in our conference room with the TV on the day of the Tiananmen Square Massacre.
Oh.
And the tears
Did they go
run
back?
down. No, they were there, but they knew that.
No, I mean, have they gone back to China?
I've lost contact with them.
Okay.
I don't know what happened to them, but I know at the time they were sitting there silently, with tears rolling down their cheeks, and there was nothing that we could say to begin to comfort them, just to be present and to witness what was happening with them.
What I find interesting is having been in conference in Germany recently and several times before that, is that this year is the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, but it's also the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yes.
And, the juxtaposition of those two events is just striking.
And add into that the events that are happening in Catholicism.
Yes.
And we are truly living in epic times right now. And as you say, the recent secret accord that's been signed and what effect that will have. Lots of prayer. We are getting really close to the end of our hour.
Okay.
This has gone so quickly. One question I do want to ask, I hope you will come back again and we can add part 2 to this, because I think we've just scratched the surface
if you think there's enough there. Yes.
I do. I think we have just scratched the surface, Dr. Kertz, and I think your bird's eye view, your expertise here, you've been there, as you've said, 27, 30 times, and for long periods of time, twice a year for 2 weeks at a stretch, and visited so much of the country. As you mentioned earlier, 15 of the 22 provinces, 3 of the 4 major municipalities, 14 airports, and your exposure with the graduate students, one-on-one, who you mentored for a period of 2 weeks at a time, and then going with you in hospitality and mentorship from one place to another, you really do have a unique perspective that is very important to hear.
At the same time, Mary Anne, I tell people I don't consider myself an expert, but I have a lot of experience in China, because to be an expert in China would be a lifetime endeavor, I think, and it's such a multi-layered, multi-centuries of history. It's just an incredible place.
One of the questions that I always ask, we are Holy Apostles College and Seminary, is for the men in formation. You've given us a lot to think about here. What piece of advice might you have for men in formation, for their rectors, their bishops, their preceptors, about China, about the people that are there? In addition to we need to pray for them. What piece of advice would you have?
Well, it's difficult in a way to answer, because we had a seminarian that left China because he started to speak out on some things, and ended up in the Vatican, and then came here and finished and is a priest, and I've talked with him. And so they have very little latitude there going through seminaries, and this would have been the Patriotic church. So I think it's just be aware that this is that world that is in China. It's a complex world, and so you don't have to become an expert about it. You understand that religious freedom is at stake there, and the reason why is because the government is becoming more and more controlling. And that's what's going on in Hong Kong. They didn't want to allow 50 years under the agreement, so here it is some 20 years later, and now the young people there especially realize if they don't stop this now, it's not going to stop. And so I think it's just an awareness of what's going on in the world around you as being in formation, and that prayer is so important at all levels.
Excellent response. Thank you so much. And you in a caveat there, you give us a warning for our own religious liberty. Just what can happen in 50 years, in 70 years, in 2 generations.
Yeah, we've had some curtailing of our own religious liberty over the last 8 to 10 years. So we have to be concerned, because it's sort of natural in a way that governments, accumulate power, and if they do, at some point it starts getting into the element of religion, because religion is, as John Paul II has made evident, is such a basic freedom. And, our own Constitution acknowledges that. It's a basic freedom, because if people can't worship and live their life according to their beliefs, then that's a restriction of freedom. And it can inevitably lead to more restrictions.
You've given us a lot to think about. As we close, listeners, you've been listening to WCAT Radio, and I am your host, Dr. Mary Anne Urlakis, and with me for this wonderful hour, I've been interviewing Dr. Al Kertz. Thank you so much for tuning in, and as we close, putting our listeners and everything that we're praying for under the protection of Our Lady, let us also finish with in our Father. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Hallowed be thy name. The kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses,
as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Lead us not into temptation, from all evil.
Deliver us from evil.
Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Lady, pray for us. Thank you again, Dr.
You're welcome. Thank you.
My guest.
All right.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece, and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.